like Royal Garden or Roblox. Well, the original game has had a long history when it comes to its daily rewards and quests, although they've been quite buggy every now and then, but I still think this is one of the easiest things you can add in order to boost player engagement. So in this episode of our How to Make a Game Like Royal Garden series, let's have a look at how you can add daily rewards inside Roblox Studio. And no worries, since this is still a tutorial, we're gonna have a look at a very simple version, like this one you can see right here, where there is just a constant type of daily reward, so it is as easy to follow as possible. But of course, if you would like to have this full version, including those animations, error messages, and even daily group rewards, you can still check out this dedicated system for that in the description if you like. So usually people either add a button to the HUD opening the daily GUI, or they add a physical object like it was just showing, and as soon as the player essentially touches it, like using their character, we trigger the reward. And this also includes saving the last time persistently, which I think is a premiere on this channel. So, for example, if we wanted to use a chest similar to the one I was just showing, you can add the toolbox up here, go to 3D assets, and then search for whatever, and just drag in the one you like. Sometimes there are scripts attached to it. You can just disable those by right clicking here, and then it says something along the lines of disable script. If it's composed of multiple parts, we need to make sure all of them are anchored. The players won't be able to knock them over and so on. And then we can essentially put it into place, like by rotating it after pressing 4. You can enable grid snapping up here. You can also increase its size, like you can multiply all of its axes by 1.5 for instance. So in this case there is this mesh object preventing it, so we can also set it here instead, and perhaps align it with our floor object. You can also enable part snapping down here. If you would also like to have this billboard GUI, like I do in my daily reward system, or this entire Royal Garden framework, you can also add it directly to workspace and look up billboard GUI. Sometimes if you need to listen to events like mouse inputs, you need to put the billboard GUI into starter GUI or player GUI, which pops up below here at runtime. But in this case, since it's only meant to be for visual purposes, we can keep it inside workspace. If you like, you can rename it. And now let's set the adornee, so the object will be assigned to, if you will. You can just do it like so, in case it is a simple part, otherwise you can also select it inside the hierarchy. Perhaps rename this too. And now you can already see it showing up, like you can tell because of this kind of blue rectangle, although it is still empty, obviously. You can give it a slight offset if you like so. Now we can just add a text label to it, like normal. And we can change its text if you like. Make the background transparent up here, make it bold, set the text color to white or green, and then let's say you also want to make it bigger, which you can do like this, and perhaps give it a slight text stroke. And you likely also want to have a maximum distance, so its internal visibility is set to false, if you will, if you get too far away. Now how do we detect players touching this object? Well, we can either do this part instead. If you have a model or you want the hitbox to be slightly larger, you can also add a dedicated hitbox part, like by setting its shape to most likely ball, kind of center it, and make it larger. You can just, enter whatever number here instead of three numbers at once, like so. By default it always uses, I think, the minimum value, and then we want to register the player overlapping with this object, but we don't really want the player to ricochet from it, if you will, or collide with it physically, so we can disable can collide. We probably want to enable anchored, pop out of the box and roll away, or fall through the ground, most likely. Make sure can touch remains enabled, and we also want to make it fully transparent, I guess, like so. If you like, you can also rename it to Hitbox or whatever. You only need to make sure to use this very name inside our code in a minute. So let's set this to test here, so we can give it a try. So everything looks correct so far, and we don't collide with the hitbox. This collision looks a bit off, and also I find it weird how dark this billboard GUI is. So when it comes to the billboard, we can set the light influence to 0, if that's your preference. And when it comes to the collision, I'm not really sure if there's anything we can do here, like inside those settings right away. Sometimes with mesh parts, we have this object down here, where we can make it more precise. But in this case, since it is a normal part with a mesh, like special mesh object attached to it, I think we would have to switch to another 3D model, or export it, and then, I don't know, for instance in Blender, make it an FBX or whatever, and re-import it as a mesh part. But now the first step inside our code would essentially be to detect whether a player is entering this hitbox. So let's add a new script to server script service. Please don't want all my existing stuff. This shouldn't really matter for this tutorial. But of course, if you're still curious, please feel free to check out the playlist. You can, for instance, rename it to dailies. We need to access the hitbox. which we can do like so, using whatever names you chose here inside the hierarchy, where wait for child essentially pauses the script's execution until it is found to make up for server delays. And if you mess this up, you will likely see a yellow message inside the console at runtime after 10 seconds or so. And now this is essentially the way how we can check whether any object touched our hitbox. In this case we just print an empty message into the console for testing. But after this we will still have to make sure to filter out any objects that aren't player characters. But let's give it a try nonetheless. So in this case you can see a whole bunch of messages which are all essentially originating from my player character, but it's still all of those single limbs you can find below my player model, which means we would probably trigger the reward more times than we actually want. So for instance, let's restrict this to our humanoid root part, which is essentially right here. Let's try it like this. If the object we're touching is, for instance, one of those other objects, then I think parent will be workspace. So I guess if all of those have a parent, we can also leave this away. But then if we're dealing with a player character, like in this case, we can access its parent, meaning the character itself, like the entire model, and see if we can find an associated player object. So I think what Roblox just does internally is accessing this player service and checking whether there's an object having the same name. And we also want the colliding object to have the name humanoid root part. So we filter out all of those, aside from this one essentially, resulting to only one instance where we trigger this code here, like so. And you can also isolate the player service like this and insert it here, so it's a little cleaner. But now how do we check whether the player is actually allowed to claim their reward yet? So for instance, if at least 24 hours have passed, one way to do that would be to save the last time the player claimed the reward and check whether 24 hours have been passed yet, like whether the current time is bigger than or is at least the last claim time plus 24 hours. And we will be diving into persistent data storage in a minute. But for now, let's just create an empty map, or a list if you will, depending on how strict you are. In here, we could insert objects like this one, where a player object, like those here, are essentially mapped to the respective time. So in here, let's try to extract the player's last claim time, in case we can find it in there. If not, we can just set it to 0, like so. So access the right last claim time, and in case it doesn't exist, we set it to 0. Now we can get access to the current time, and check whether its difference is at least 24 hours, so 24 times 60 times 60 seconds. And I think this one uses the seconds, like the number of seconds passed since 1970, I think that we were looking up last time. So for instance, now we're sitting at 1 million seconds, and the last claim time was just 900,000 seconds. Then it means more than 24 hours have passed, and we can claim the reward and update the time. Like put a new value inside here. If you don't have a currency system yet, you can also just do a print for testing and see whether or not it works. There we go. So there we have our $100 and the console message. And the reason why this works for me is because my player currency is essentially stored below here. So there it says balance, with this here being the exact value. If you want me to dive deeper into this, you can also check out our third episode. But essentially you don't have to do it this way. You can also grant anything essentially to your players or set it up completely differently. But in my case, it's player, then access the balance, and then its value attribute, and increment it by 100 for instance. But now as you will see, as soon as I restart the thing, meaning the server also restarts, I can again claim $100. Now the reason why it still says 100 is just because the player balance isn't stored persistently. But still you can tell 24 hours haven't passed yet. Not sure what the previous timestamp was, but I would assume only 1 minute or 2 have passed now. Which is because after restarting the game, we essentially start with a blank slate again, with this again empty. Meaning we will have to find a way to store this persistently, which Roblox offers an API for. Meaning we can send the data to the servers and obtain it again the next time a server starts. So in order to activate this inside Studio, we need to go to File and Experience Settings, and in here we can enable Studio access to API services. You won't need to use this one, this is just for testing on my end. So now we can get access to the respective servers, providing this exact functionality, and open a new database if you like. So you can call it dailies if you want to reset it. You can also, add whatever integer after it, since at the time of this recording, Roblox doesn't really allow you to delete data stores, which doesn't matter. And we want to retrieve the player's data, like from this database, whenever a new player joins. So this is how we can detect just that, with a debug method for the testing again. There you go. And now this is the key interface used to retrieve the data from the table, from the server. Within our case, and this is highly recommended, the player's user ID used to identify the correct entry inside this database. So this is what we temporarily store up here and insert here. So now get success will tell us whether the operation was successful or not, and table with info being the data we sent to the server beforehand, which in our case we didn't. So let's see what this object actually is. So null meaning it doesn't exist yet, which makes sense. We didn't save anything persistently yet. And now we can check for that exact info. In case there's any existing data, we can store it inside a map the way we did up here. But maybe let's rename this to saves and remove this since we will be using another structure. So if it exists, we could just put it in there. And if not, we open an empty save state, if you will. And in our case, we only want to have one daily reward, so we can as well call this last claimed or whatever. In my separate system, I'm using those 2 daily rewards, and also in my premium framework. So this is why I just said last 1 and last 2. So let's have a look and print this again. Maybe the entire saves table, so we can have a look at that as well. Now we have this table, players being mapped to their respective save data, which is correct. This way we're just one layer higher, if you will. And we're starting with a blank save data, where last claimed is just set to 0, meaning we entered this branch correctly. Oh, and make sure to replace this with saves again. But now if I re-enter the game and the server restarts, we're still left with an empty save state, which is because we don't save it yet, we only load the data from Roblox's backend. So I can either say player start to player removing, or put it directly inside here, since we already know the player, and connect to its character removing function, so it happens slightly before player object disappears, like gets removed from the server. Then we can essentially use this interface where it says set async, like asynchronous, and this time we can put the player's save data in here, and again use the user ID to get or set the right entry. And unfortunately, since the studio environment sometimes works slightly different than the published version, like inside the player, like Roblox's standard player app, you might also, in case this doesn't work for you inside Studio, you might also want to go with this approach I was just showing you, or this one for instance, where this code snippet is executed once the server shuts down, and iterate over all players in order to save. But then the issue becomes players rejoining like the same server, because if you only do it this way, since the server didn't shut down yet, the player's save data might not have been stored yet on their backend. So at the time of this video this will work, but you can also combine all of those, just to be sure. Alright, now since we're dealing with a table, we need to access last claim, like this, or last claimed rather, and also update this attribute instead of the entire table. And I also think I want to add another print here. What does it look like now? So one more bug. Alright, we need to replace this with saves. So now I just claimed the daily reward. Let's see what happens when I quit and rejoin the server, open a new one to be precise. So we might have already run into one of those timing issues I just told you about. What happens if we add a print here? Exactly, we won't even get the print, meaning this one doesn't finish on time before the server is shutting down. So that's essentially the same thing inside this players.playRemoving variant I was just telling you about, and see if this does the trick for us. Again, it's also a bit of a lottery at times. So what happens when rejoining? Still says 0. Okay, so I restarted Roblox Studio now, and for whatever reason it started working now. And I think I will still leave this in so you can see it's not all roses. Like sometimes, if you're struggling in computer science, it might actually be better or healthy to see, it's essentially what everyone is struggling with. So I ended up using just this one again now. If you want to make this more robust, what you might also want to do, like instead of keeping it simple, is using the user ID here, so you don't have to bother whether the player object still exists. And what you can also tell is our arithmetic, so the calculation whether we're actually allowed to claim the next reward, is working too. And now as soon as I try to re-enter it, I'm not being granted the reward. As you can tell, the currency is still sitting at 0. And now the way you can add a feedback GUI, like I did in my example, but where it says congrats, here's your daily reward, is by adding a screen GUI right here to starter GUI. So this time go with screen GUI, so it is projected right onto the screen. If you like, you can disable screen insets, so it doesn't get squashed by Roblox's built-in default GUI, this Roblox icon and so on. Now we can add a new frame to it, replace this by 0.5, So from now on Roblox knows it should use relative positions and sizes. And we can rescale it like this if you like. Give it some color, set its transparency. We can also add a close button to it by adding a text button, an obvious name. Demo old trick here, move it to the top right and rescale it. Yeah, and then we can set its background color 3 to red again. The reason sometimes it says 3 at the end is because it doesn't you can go with whatever color in here, like within the given accuracy, instead of this brick color selection Roblox sometimes uses, like for standard parts. You can set the text to X and make it white, perhaps also slightly bigger and bold. And we can also add a text label to it, like we did with the Reward GUI. You can see in the background. Make it use a relative size, and then I guess you can probably just set it to 1, so 100%. Have it have a transparent background. In my case I also want to change the text color again, make it as big as you like. And then if you would like to have multiple messages, you can essentially duplicate this frame and call one of them, I don't know, not a group frame or whatever, and hide it, like by setting visible to false by default. But now when it comes to the basics, let's just go with this one, and for instance set its text to this one for instance, and then we likely want to set this to be disabled again by changing this attribute. That also means now we can add a new local script, the first one after a while to be honest, if you've been following this series, call it dailies or so. And inside here we can get you access to all of its elements we care about essentially. So get access to the local player first, since this is a local script. Get access to player GUI, which is where all of what we put in here is pasted into essentially at runtime. And then get access to daily reward, make sure those names match, and the frame and the close button actually. Like so, and for testing we can just set it to enabled for now. There we go. Now let's check out how we can connect this close button to now. The same thing essentially, we connect to the activated event, when it comes to the close button, which is fired by either tapping or clicking it, and then setting this back to being disabled. So now whenever we click it, it disappears correctly. Awesome. But now since this needs to happen on the client, the server kind of needs to notify the client. It should enable this GUI. So in order to do this, we can add a new so-called remote event to replicated storage. For instance, open daily GUI. Now we can get access to it on the server like so, and trigger it like this. If you want to be able to test this more easily, you can also, for instance, add or true to it, so this entire condition is satisfied each and every time now for testing, and this way you don't need to memorize this part of it. You can just remove this addition before publishing the game. We need to get access to the same event on the client, and then we can listen to it like this and connect this new function to it, which will just set the daily GUI back to enabled, and presumably remove this since it was just for testing. So let's see where we're at right now. There you go. My example, reward being granted correctly, and here's our GUI, which we can disable, or rather hide by clicking X. But obviously you can see I'm able to do this, which is essentially because of this exact setup we just did for testing. Okay, so you can just remove this again if we prefer. Awesome. So if you compare what you just saw with what we have here inside my premium framework, you can see we're pretty much good to go. Like, this is essentially all you need in order to publish your own Grow a Garden-like game. But given the recent launch of Grow a Garden 2, where you can essentially also steal plants or fruits from other players, I could imagine this being worth another tutorial as well. And I might also actually add it to this framework you can find in the description. For now, if you need help with any of this, feel free to let me know, like either in the comments or directly, and I'll see you in the next one.